Okay, we're continuing with Emergence of the U.S. as a World Power, Part 4. And we're moving further down the question sheet under Origins of Imperialism. I'm going to punt some of this to the supplements. We'll see when we get there. Brief note of who in general were the so-called foreign policy elite. Okay, an elite means the highest class or a governing class. And let's say at any given time, if you were the president, the Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, they're highly placed people near the center of our government in a number of agencies that are in position to influence what our foreign policy is about anything. It's only a tiny sliver of the whole U.S. population, but that's the foreign policy elite. Some people kind of have a problem with that. I do myself a little bit, but anyway, if all those people got up on the same morning with the same idea about what we should do, it's a pretty good bet that's what we're going to do. So the thing is, as the 19th century drew to a close, our foreign policy elite of that era became very excited, optimistic, starry-eyed about the United States coming into its own as last and joining the great powers of the world. We were already a great power economically, but as I mentioned the other day, the hallmark of a great power was having imperial possessions offshore, overseas. So that day was coming. Foreign policy elite. Now, next up, there are two writers from the late 19th century. Both of them were coming from a basically religious viewpoint, but somewhat unconventional religious viewpoints. If you want to check them out on Wikipedia, go ahead. Probably for our purposes, the 1302 supplements would do it. Their names were John Fiske and Josiah Strong. Okay? And although they weren't primarily promoting racism, it factored in pretty strongly in their mindset and the way they thought. And they're maybe less influences than they are symptoms of just the ideas at that time. One thing I might point out, one of them especially promoted a popular idea he referred to as the Anglo-Saxon race. I want to tell you that racism went virtually unchallenged in late 19th and early 20th century America, but apparently, what it looks to me like, they were using the word race the way we would use the word ethnicity. Okay? Like the French were a race and the Germans were a race. It's not the way the race has been used mostly since. But the thing about the Anglo-Saxons, do I have time for this? Probably not. But it was a major concept, and for historical purposes, you probably ought to know about it. Kind of where it came from. We're going to go back about 1,500 years, a little further. What is now Britain was part of the Roman Empire for way longer than the United States has existed. It was as a province called Britannia. It did not include what's now Wales or Scotland. Okay, the people there spoke Latin. They had pretty well lost any connection to, their ancestors who were already there when the Romans came. Okay. The Roman Empire is getting weaker and weaker, and in the early 5th century, this is right after the year 400, the Roman army was withdrawn from the province of Britannia, where basically they had manned a wall that went all the way across the island, separating or protecting the Roman province from the Scots, who were considered wild heathen barbarians and were not under imperial rule. So you had this big wall out there. Still there. It's obviously well deteriorated, but you can easily see where it was. Anyway, these Latin-speaking Britons, they didn't know how to defend themselves, So they were increasingly being raided by the Scots and some other group called the Picts, and I have no idea who the Picts were, but apparently they were bad boys. So somebody came up with what looked like a good idea. Why don't we hire some good barbarians, barbarians being people who were by definition uncivilized, not part of the Roman Empire. We'll hire some good barbarians to ward off the bad barbarians. So the people they hired were fighters from northern Germany. And Germany, the German states still reflect this. Well over a millennium later, they were the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes, who may have come from Denmark. So they would come over in the summers, it's the first half of the 400s, protect from the bad barbarians, the Scots, and go back home. But they liked the country, and according to the way the story is told, in the late 440s, they just stayed. And either pushed out or eliminated or conceivably just intermingled with the previous population and took over. And over time, they adopted Christianity. The Romans, people there before already were, but they did that, and they set up a number of kingdoms, some of which remain today as English counties. I've never watched Game of Thrones, but again, I get the impression it's set in the second half of the first millennium AD, and you're talking about kingdoms much like the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Well, anyway, the belief in the late 19th century was, and they're stretching it just a little, and they knew it, all the English-speaking people in the world, that's the United States, and a British Empire so huge and extensive that they boasted the sun never set on the British Empire. That didn't necessarily mean it's going to last forever. That means that wherever the sun is shining at any given moment, it's shining on British flags over British possessions. You had the United Kingdom, you had a good bit of Africa, you had Canada, you had Australia, you had New Zealand, you had parts of South America and the Caribbean. It's big. Well, anyway, all the English-speaking people constituted an Anglo-Saxon race. This is about the same time anthropology is being invented. The first anthropologists were dedicated racists who, what they're trying to do is document all the different distinct races, and they had upwards of 24 at least in the world. Analyze them, and it was assumed that each race had its genius. That doesn't mean its smartest person. That means something that race was better at than any other race. It was assumed that the genius of the Anglo-Saxon race was government, because the Anglo-Saxons had invented the constitutional republic and enjoyed a higher degree of freedom and generally prosperity than anybody else. It's all too easy from there, isn't it? That gave the Anglo-Saxons, the Brits and the Americans, a mandate to spread benevolent rule over as much of the planet as possible and, provide the highest form of government. This isn't on the worksheet, but I'm going to throw it in here. Educated people had all taken something like world history in high school or college, which basically meant ancient and European history, and the way it was outlined was a series of empires that rose and fell in turn over a period of about 4,000 or 5,000 years. You had the Egyptians, you had the Babylonians, you had the Assyrians, you had the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, etc. And each empire, it was believed, had fallen from within. That's probably true. But the current reigning empire was the British Empire. And that's a big empire, big, heavy empire for a country no bigger than the United Kingdom. So they're starting to lose their grip. And of course, after they go down, the next great empire would arise. Who would that be? How about us? It was all too easy to assume that the next great world empire would be the United States. And although some say that just foreign trade is an example of imperialism, I do not buy that. We're not imperialistic in the way even the British were with actual takeovers. But as far as being the most powerful and influential country, which brings us benefits we should not take for granted, I guess that might have been true. Okay. There are two other writers, and I probably won't get through with both of them. These are very serious historians, to be taken more seriously than John Fiske and Josiah Strong. There was a naval officer named Alfred T. Mahan. He was also a good historian. He held a rank that's been dropped in the Navy for a very long time now. He was a Commodore, and I'm not sure where that fits. It may be just above or just below a captain, who's the equivalent of a colonel in the Army. But Commodore Mahan was on the faculty of a new institution called the Naval War College, established, I believe, in the 1880s to provide advanced training for officers who are destined for high rank. Now, Mahan wrote 3 books analyzing how naval power had been used down through history in the world. The first one was most influential. It was published in 1890. It was entitled The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And it analyzed how it was that a relatively small country with a small population and limited natural resources like Britain could become and remain a dominant world power for as long as they did, nearly 2 centuries. And its answer was the secret lay in Britain's immense navy, the Grand Fleet. Obviously, with power, with a fleet like that, they can project their power into remote parts of the world. They can protect their far-flung global commerce and run up their flag on the far side of the planet. Takeaway: sea power equaled world power. The nation that wants to control the world must control the sea. So we're not quite through with Mahan yet, but British leaders read the book and figured out what they'd been doing right all the time. German leaders read the book and launched a kind of naval arms race with the Brits to see who could build the biggest, fastest, most heavily armed dreadnought. That's what they called battleships in those days. If you're on the most powerful ship, you have naught, which means nothing, naught to dread. American leaders like Theodore Roosevelt, future president, read the book, and they too saw what could be done. And the United States began a naval upgrade program, which began in 1883, at which time our Navy was ranked right behind the Chilean Navy. We hardly had one. And by the end of the century, it was ranked 7th, and by the time Theodore Roosevelt left office in 1909, it was ranked 3rd, and it's been 1st ever since World War II. China has more ships. I doubt that they're more powerful. Anyway, now, Mahan understood the importance of sea power in protecting foreign commerce. And if I had you in the classroom, I'd pull down a world map and ask you to look at it and see how many potential world powers you could see on that map that had significant warm water frontage on both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And if you were clever and quick, you would easily see that we are the only one. Only Western Hemisphere countries do that. Canada, but Canada is mostly too cold to live in. They don't have much Pacific Ocean frontage. They're not a candidate for world power status. 90% of the Canadian population, which is about equivalent of the population of California, lives within 100 miles of the U.S. border. Mexico has frontage. Mexico and good natural resources and lots of really clever people, but they've got some problems they're going to need to solve before they become a world power, and if they got good sense, they wouldn't want to be. But that's about it. The Central American countries are too small. So that's us. Now, we have a unique problem, okay? And I'm going to tell you what it was when we get to part 5.